Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm TX141, but you may call me Paul. Welcome you all to a brand new pair of Ace in the Day gameplays for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the Bayerische Flugzeugwerke 900 K-4 Wir, also known as the Messerschmitt 19 K-4, a German fighter aircraft coming at a tier 4 and a battle rating of 6.0. To provide you with a generalised account of the history behind the K series and the history behind this subvariant in particular, we must realise that the K series of the Bf-109 was to be the final production version of the fighter. It was an attempt to reduce the number of subtypes of the Bf-109, standardising the fighter's assembly lines to a single production model. Based off of the G10 variant, the K incorporated a number of aerodynamic improvements, leading to the first pre-production Bf-109K0 fighters being converted from late series G airframes and arriving in September of 1944. The external differences between the two, i.e. the pre-production K0s and the original G airframes, included but were not limited to a raised engine cowling line, lengthened air screw spinner, standardisation of the gallant hood, and the standardisation of the enlarged wooden tail assembly and semi-retractable tail wheel. The K0s were powered by the same engine as the G10, the Daimler-Benz DB605 DB inline engine, with a capacity for the GM1 nitrous oxide injection system. The initial production models of the K were the K2 and the K4, with the two only differing in that the K4 permitted cabin pressurisation for higher altitude operation. These variants started to arrive in October of 1944 and were powered by the inline 2000 horsepower Daimler-Benz 605 ASCM engine, which was renamed the DB605 DCM engine if the plane had the capacity for the GM1 injection. The planes were equipped with one 30mm Mk108 motor cannon with 60 rounds, and two 15mm MG151 heavy machine guns semi-enclosed in the engine cowling with 220 rounds per gun. Later production series K4s switched to the 30mm Mk103 cannon as the motor cannon, and this setup was adopted for the K6, which would act as the anti-bomber variant. To assist the K6 in this role, the K6 was also equipped with two 30mm Mk103s in underwing pods, and replaced the 15mm machine guns in the cowling with two 30mm MG131 machine guns. This variant started arriving in limited numbers as of January 1945. The final notable K variant was the K14, which was delivered in very small numbers in the final 2 weeks of the war in Europe, i.e. the end of April 1945 into the early stages of May 1945. This was to be the high-performance K variant, powered by an inline DB605L Daimler-Benz engine, which contained a two-stage supercharger. Focusing on the K4 in particular, as depicted on your screen right now, with its Daimler-Benz DB605 DCM engine, the performance characteristics were thus. For a total loaded mass of 3,100 kg, not including any underwing pods or Rosetson, the top speed at sea level for this plane was 608 km per hour, increasing to 700 km an hour at an altitude of 7,500 metres. The time to climb to 12,000 metres altitude was 10.2 minutes, and the service ceiling for the plane was 12,500 metres altitude. And with our historical overview out of the way, let us see how the Messerschmitt 19 K4 handles in War Thunder. For our first game of today, we're on the ground strike map Lonely Island using the following setup. The Intermediate Adjustment Incendiary or IAI belt for our 30mm machine guns. The reasoning here is that these belts comprise solely of the IAI rounds, which are meant to historically represent the high explosive incendiary rounds that were available to the 30mm MG131 heavy machine gun. Whilst in game, in my experience, these rounds do less damage by comparison with their armour-piercing incendiary counterparts. The offset to this is the fact that the high explosive incendiary filler provides a spread of damage when the round is instant on target. Instead of the damage being localised to, say, the wing spar or indeed the central fuselage, you will find that the damage will spread, so if you impact the central portion of the wing, some of the damage will be replicated onto the central fuselage or towards the engine or the cockpit, and likewise if we take it from the other direction. This means that over the course of a sustained burst, you can do a significant amount of damage to the entire fuselage of an enemy aircraft rather than just a single portion of the plane, which can help you out when you're going up against tougher targets such as attackers and bombers, or alternatively against those fighters which are a little bit too manoeuvrable for you to bring in your 30mm cannon. Additionally, the high explosive rounds, or at least as they are represented here, spark significantly when they impact on a target, and this will help you to gauge when to bring in that 30mm Mk103 cannon which has a much slower muzzle velocity by comparison with the 710 meters per second muzzle velocity of the heavy machine guns. We therefore move on to our belt choice of a 30mm cannon, and that is the Omni-Purpose belt. Reasoning here is that all 3 belts available other than the default belt comprise of a mixture of 3 high explosive incendiary Meinengeschoss rounds to a single incendiary round. This means unless you want to sacrifice the tracers by using the stealth belts, there is very little difference between the lot of them. This means our choice is based on the fact that we want to have a tracer which we can witness and therefore indicate when we are hitting our target, hence the choice of the Omni-Purpose belt. And when these rounds are incident on target, you only usually need 2 to finish off an enemy fighter, and up to 5 or 6 to knock out an enemy bomber on a good pass. For our gun convergence, we are using a 500m gun convergence, as all of our armament in this game is based in the nose. We are not using the 20mm cannon pods for this game, but our second game will do so. And for our fuel load, we are using the standardised 30-minute fuel load to ensure that we can make it to the end of the game unscathed in terms of fuel capacity. We initiate this gameplay with an analysis of the climb rate of the Messerschmitt 109 K-4. Before I started flying this plane, I heard that the climb rate of the 109 K-4 was legendary, and you can see here how legendary it truly is. We are up at 6,300 meters altitude, and we have not rushed to get up here. We rushed to 5,000 meters altitude approximately, but then we levelled out and gradually made our way even higher. This means that for its battle rating and tier, this plane has one of the best, if not the best, climb rate of all planes available. There are some planes that can match it, such as the F-8F-1B Bearcat at a battle rating of 6.3, and some of the later Griffon Spitfires, such as the Mark 24, but you'll be hard pressed to find a plane that can outclimb this aircraft until you push towards the jet era of aircraft, especially up at a battle rating of 6.7 onwards. This means we can dive down from above the cloud layers when they are available in a game to surprise our opponents, knocking out that Messerschmitt 109 K-4 with a single 30mm round towards their tail section, which wiped it cleanly off the face of the earth. The TA-152H1 has caught onto our presence, but here we can catch onto the back of a Yak-9T, and whilst our initial burst achieves a critical hit with a mixture of rounds, we finished them off with our 13mm machine guns to show how powerful the high explosive incendiary rounds can be when they are instant over a sustained burst. We saw the Yak-9T burst into flames over its entirety, and now we push towards a Spitfire F, most likely a Mark 22 Griffon, which is completely unaware of our presence, and our mixture of firepower from our cannon and our 2 heavy machine guns is enough to set them on fire and cause them to burn to death for our 3rd kill. So we can very quickly see how the very powerful climb rate of this plane and its centralised armament means that we can wipe out our opponents from behind without them even knowing we're there until the wrong time, when they really should have got out of the way. This means as we push back up above the cloud layer once again in order to retain our position and push back towards the enemy spawn, we can take our time, and this first gameplay is not going to be as frantic as one might expect. The cloud layer has worked in our favour here, but this is something to be very aware of with the K-4 even when the clouds are not available. This plane loves to push for altitude, and your climb rate only begins to drop off at approximately 5,750 meters altitude, at which point you will need to build up a little bit more speed than you're used to and reduce your climb angle. For reference, I usually push for a climb angle of 27.5 degrees. This is not something I've ingrained into my head, but something just that comes from muscle memory from flying all aircraft, and it is my standard climb angle. At 27.5 degrees in a climb, as we saw at the start of the game, or approximating to, this plane climbs very well. And when you want to initiate situations such as climbing, or indeed any sort of manoeuvres or dogfights, you ideally want to kick off at a speed of approximately 400 to 450 km an hour, as this is where this plane performs at its best. And as you go to higher altitudes, you may need to stick to this threshold even more, because above 6,000 meters altitude this plane begins to drop in terms of performance. And this is where planes such as the TA-152H1 and the Focke-Wulf 190 D12 come into a world of their own by comparison. Where their battle ratings are 6.3, they are the opposite number to the Messerschmitt 109 K-4, and they are more suitable for the much higher altitude performance. But this plane still handles well in the extreme altitude regions, but sometimes it does not handle as well as its opponents may anticipate. We now begin to dive down, having reloaded our guns and pushed our altitude back up to just shy of 6,000 meters, and this means that we can go in for another extreme dive. And we can see here how the K-4 builds up its speed very nicely, pushing in excess of 850 km an hour with ease, and it means we can swoop down to attack a B-17. Unfortunately, due to a small latency error, either on their part or ours, we were not able to pick up the kill, but only picked up a critical hit towards the B-17's tail. But that will be enough to put them out of action for the time being, or make them an easy kill for one of our teammates. We now have to deal with the Ki-49 Mark II, which is coming up towards us and trying to act as a gunship. So we're going to cut past close in order to make sure they cannot bring their guns to bear for a sustained period of time, and then we weave out the way of a Dornier 217E4 that is trying to get their forward facing 20mm cannon onto us. Here we do not want to get into a firefight for too long. We're above the enemy spawn, we may have another fighter or two come up towards us, or indeed another bomber or attacker come up towards us, and it is a vulnerable situation for us. We put a couple of shots into the Ki-49 too to push them away, but we have done our job, disrupting the bomber formation before it can make its way to target. It buys our team a little bit more time to try and knock out the enemy ground targets in this game. We now push for a reload, and one thing to note is that you have a limited ammunition capacity with this plane. With only 65 rounds for the 30mm cannon and 600 rounds in total for the 13mm machine guns, i.e. 300 rounds per gun, reloads are going to be rather frequent, especially on the cannon if you do not control your trigger finger, and if you happen to open fire at longer distances, you may experience some frustration. In the meantime, we begin to loop around and go into another diagonal split S to come down this Messerschmitt 109. They seem to be unaware of our presence once again, and so we try to make the most of it. But the 109 starts to react. It is a G10, and we manage to clip them with our 30mm machine guns. We did not provide just enough lead for our 30mm cannon to hit, but we can see how the 13mm with their superior muzzle velocity can be brought into the frame. Here we catch on to the fact another Griffin Spitfire is trying to head over towards our friendly units and is completely unaware of our presence, so we ignite a Mark 18 and send them down towards the ground. In the meantime, the G10 breaks off of us and we climb back up, with a good portion of our energy retained in a straight line, although not as well as say the Focke-Wulf 190 D12 or the TA-152 H1, and this is one of the differences of this plane. The Messerschmitt 19 K-4 does not retain its energy as well when going up into a climb, or alternatively when it is flying in a straight line, and below an altitude of 4,000 metres altitude you will find this plane bleeds its speed rather rapidly, and this is something to be aware of whether you're flying it or flying against it. Still, this plane has a decent top speed at lower altitude and is difficult to catch once it comes out of a dive, although it will depreciate in its speed below 500 km an hour, so if you come out at a dive at 750 km an hour at quite a quick rate. In the meantime, we have a Focke-Wulf 190 F8 trying to come up underneath us, so we decide to tease them by ruddering over the top of them whilst they try to get a shot for our friendly Messerschmitt 19 G10 to finish them off. If the G10 had not been there, we would have swept around on the rudder, cut our engine and come in for the kill. Because we now come on to the manoeuvrability of the K-4, and what is very interesting is that in terms of the history behind this plane, this is a plane which was derived from the G10 with a number of aerodynamic improvements. And what this does is essentially place the K-4 on a level which you're probably used to when you started taking the Messerschmitt 19s quite seriously. And that era, or at least in my opinion, and it may be for the majority of you, was where you used to fly the Messerschmitt 19 F4. Now the two planes are very different. The K-4 is powered by a much more powerful engine, and the overall nature of the armament and the layout of the plane has changed to some extent, as we keep an eye on a Spitfire LF Mark 9 Premium trying to climb up underneath us. We sweep around and see that the Spitfire is stalling out, so we're going to try and finish them off for a clean kill. Once done, we're going to carry our momentum through for a bit, and then realise that all of our opponents are trying to push down to lower altitudes, alternatively they may be sweeping up behind us. It is a risky situation, and we do see a Messerschmitt 19 trying to come up to dogfight us. As a result, we're going to overuse our war emergency power and extent, and start to level out in the clouds, once again retreating to the safe haven which this plane thrives in. Noting the Messerschmitt 19 just lingering out of touch at the moment. But when we come around to the manoeuvrability, and we return to that point right now, with the 109 F4 we found that the manoeuvrability of the plane and the combination of the energy fighter tactics was brilliant, and that with moderate to high speeds with the F4 the plane handled really nicely. And this has been restored with the K4 to a huge extent as we go into a dogfight right now with a Messerschmitt 19 G10, the one from earlier. We can see here that we both go for the head-on pass, but we're too nervous to go directly head-to-head, so we miss each other, and we're going to use our superior engine performance here by comparison with the G10 in order to force them to bleed out their energy underneath us. It's risky, but we've got to play it safe, so we're going to keep above them and gradually put ourselves onto their tail as they try to outmaneuver us now that we are on their 6 rather than they. The G10 pilot is very good here, and I'd like to give a shout out to the pilot. Unfortunately I haven't seen their name. But as we can see here, our manoeuvrability and our ability to retain and rebuild our energy better than the G10 means that we can gradually pick up the win in the dogfight. And a shout out to John120 Jur for his capabilities as we pick up our 6th kill. if it is a gentleman of course. We now level out at 3,800 meters altitude, and we could see in that dogfight how the handling characteristics of the K-4 have returned to the level on the F4. I did say in my review of the G10 it was a return to form, but this is something unique. And with that game over, let us take a look at the post-game stats. With our 6 kills and single assist, we're able to pick up 23,850 silver lions and 3,026 research points. We conclude our first game then by realising just how powerful an energy fighter the 109 K-4 is without pods. This plane has one of, if not the best climb rate for a fighter in terms of its battle rating and tier combination, meaning that this will be the first plane to penetrate the cloud layer on a given map, or alternatively an altitude of 5,000 meters. In doing so, it can then force its opponents who are climbing up underneath it to face it, to stall out, or alternatively intimidate them into flying below it and focusing their attention below them rather than up towards the heavens of the skies, at which point the 109 K-4 can swoop down in very fast passes, and so long as it gets in close behind its opponents, usually catching them unaware, as we saw in a number of cases in this game, it can rip them apart at a range of say 300 to 400 meters thanks to the sheer firepower of the 30mm cannon, backed up by the rather substantial 30mm machine guns. You are only going to need somewhere between 1 to 5 30mm cannon rounds in order to break apart any foe, and you have the energy retention thereafter in order to break up above the cloud layer once again, or back up to your higher altitude reservoir to build up your energy and go again. Your energy retention in a straight line, and in terms of return climb after a boom and zoom pass, may not be that of the level of the TA-152H1, but it is enough to keep this plane going, and so long as you do not let your opponents get onto a similar altitude level as yourself, you'll be in the clear. And by sticking to this approach, we came 6th by comparison to the rest of our team, demonstrating some of the more manoeuvrable aspects of the K-4 towards the end in the 1 vs 1 dogfight with the G10, but we will come on to that a little bit more as we now go into our second game and also analyse how the manoeuvrability of this plane and its overall nature is affected when we apply the R5 20mm cannon pod modification. For our second and final game of today, we're on the air domination map Mozdok, using the same setup as before, but this time also adding in the Rosettes and Fünf, the 20mm underwing gondola cannons. For these cannons we will be using the air target belts, as these comprise the majority of high explosive incendiary Minengeschoss rounds, which are very potent against both fighter and bomber alike. We also have the rather nice visibility on these rounds going into the target, thanks to a single fragmentation incendiary tracer round existing within these belts, with the tracer providing such visibility. We are using a 500 meter gun convergence once again, and the reason for this we will come on to when we discuss the advantages of using the 20mm cannon pods on the K-4. But in the meantime, let us talk about the disadvantages that the cannon pods confer. And one of the key ones you may be asking about is the impact to the overall climb rate. In terms of the standard climb rate of this plane, the impact is rather small. To provide you with an idea, for every 1000 meters altitude that you can gain in a K-4 without the cannon pods attached at a climb angle of 27.5 degrees as seen in the first game, you lose approximately 75 meters altitude, which in itself is not too much of a compromise and one that can be worked around by starting your climb at approximately 25 km an hour more speed. The main sacrifice, however, as we reverse our direction 180 degrees, is in terms of the acceleration that you gain when you go into your war emergency power stages during your climb. What do I mean by this? Well, the ability for the plane to pick up its speed when you activate the web, which we typically use in our climbing technique. This capability is rather strong in the K-4 without the cannon pods attached. However, when you add in the cannon pods, this ability is severely diminished unless you drop your climb angle slightly. But in doing this, you expose yourself to having to penetrate further into enemy territory if you start your climb directly towards the enemy. So on the one hand, you may have to climb out to the side of the map and expose your intent straight from the start, or alternatively you have to push more towards the centre of the map. And whilst we normally reverse our direction anyway in an air domination game once we start our climb, you can imagine this having an impact in a ground strike game or an airfield domination match. Nonetheless, once the plane levels out and it is up at approximately 5,000 meters altitude, as we see here, the straight line acceleration of the plane is very similar with or without the pods. And the plane in general does not accelerate very well above 350 km an hour unless you apply war emergency power, and this is something to be aware of. but the acceleration is consistent all the way up to approximately 7,500 meters altitude thanks to the addition of the GM1 injection. And this means that this plane, so long as you rely a little bit more on the GM1 boost, can build up its speed very nicely. But we must now, as we try to dive after a Focke-Wulf 190 from way too far away, come onto the fact that the gun pods also compromise the ability for this plane to both retain energy when coming out of a dive and going up into a zoom climb, and also its ability to pick up speed in a dive. Once you hit approximately 700 km an hour in a dive, this plane begins to accelerate in a dive a lot more slowly than with the K-4 without the pods. And on top of this, your energy retention when going up into a zoom climb is a lot less, although we will quantify this through an example later on in this match. As a result, it would seem so far that the compromises to this plane are rather negative on the whole, and ones that should not be overlooked. And in terms of the manoeuvrability impact, it is much like with the G10 when we mounted the 20mm cannon pods on that plane in the review, which you may see using a link in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now. We found there that the plane was less stable, especially at speeds below 300 km an hour, but at these speeds the G10 handled a lot worse in terms of its overall manoeuvrability anyway, and the same applies to the K-4. Its manoeuvrability begins to fade away below 300 km an hour, especially below 250 km an hour, and this is a key weak spot for engaging the plane. On the other hand, the manoeuvrability of the plane is still at its standard, rather nice level at 400 to 450 km an hour. With its powerful rudder, its decent elevator response, and its decent roll rate, which begins to lock up at 600 km an hour and is severely locked up by the time you hit 750 km an hour as we dive down on a Spitfire LF Mark 9, cutting them apart at close range for our first kill. We now begin to see the impact on our energy retention and our ability to zoom climb as we break back up above the cloud layer. We would be able to reach a much higher altitude in my opinion, approximately 250 to 300 meters more altitude if we did not have the pods attached. And this is why we're going to have to rely on more emergency power in order to offset this even more than we originally had to do so without the pods attached to the plane. However, in terms of the stability of the aircraft, we have seen already in a number of slight level out hammerhead turns on the rudder, the plane becomes less stable at lower speeds thanks to the cannon pods, and this is something one has to be aware of when trying to perform those stalling manoeuvres on planes which are coming out to attack you. Firstly, you will not be able to climb for as long when the opponent is trying to climb up underneath you, and secondly, the rudder control will not be as flexible to your desire, whereby you may find yourself in a position much more exposed than you intended to be, and you cannot cut your manoeuvres as fine at lower speeds thanks to the instability of the pods. But, with all these negatives in hand, we should really come on to the positives that 20mm cannons confer. And the most important one is in terms of the additional firepower provided, but not in terms of the burst mass rating. Instead, we should tend to think of it of the range provided with the 20mm cannons, and that is why we have stuck with a 500 meter gun convergence. The low muzzle velocity of the 30mm Mk108 cannon means that you need to get in close. We emphasise that in the first game, with our typical engagement range where we scored a decent shot on target being about 400 meters. With the 20mm cannons in play, your engagement range instantly goes up to approximately 600 meters, especially on a smaller target such as a fighter who may be unaware of your encroaching presence. And this means you do not have to get as close to score decent hits on a target. We now go into another boom and zoom pass here and start off by picking on an XP38G, the experimental P38 Lightning, cutting them apart very quickly. Upon doing so, we carry our momentum forward, looking around to make sure no fighters are coming after us or in close range. We now pick up on a Focke-Wulf 190 just underneath us, heading towards our friendlies, but they are slightly out of reach for the time being as we need to consider all alternatives. We notice a Bearcat off to the side. But gradually here we are starting to increase the distance at which we open fire on our targets, and our next boom and zoom pass will take an even longer range approach if I remember correctly from this video. And what this means in turn is we do not have to rely as much on the power of the 30mm cannon unless we are going up against the most heavily armed and armoured targets such as B-17s and G8Ns. This confers more confidence in the capabilities of the K-4, as this is one of the unsettling factors from the start of the stock grind all the way through to when this plane is fully upgraded, is the fact you have to get in close, or at least in my opinion. And this can be incredibly dangerous when you're trying to get that close shot on a highly manoeuvrable plane such as a J2M5 who may at the last moment make a sharp turn and you may fly into them accidentally simply because you do not have the ability to control your plane as well at speeds in excess of 800 km an hour if you have come from one of those very long distance and high altitude passes. We notice a Messerschmitt 109 on our peripheral vision towards our left being lured up by a friendly attacker. The British jet fighter bomber coming at a battle rating of 7.3 but down tiered for the purposes of this game, or down BR'd we should say. We look directly in front and see a P-63 A-10 King Cobra, and now we're coming onto our example of how the energy retention and climbing characteristics of the K-4 are affected by the addition of the 20mm cannon pods. We all are aware, or I hope we are all aware, of the fact that the P-63 A-10 climbs very well so long as its altitude is not pressed too hard and its acceleration is phenomenal, especially in a straight line. We see here the P-63 begin to loop over in terms of an Immelmann, and we try to pass after them. We notice however we are too far away and the P-63 A-10 pilot is smart, starting to level out before going into their own split test to build up their speed. And here with our starting speed of approximately 430 km an hour at an altitude of 5,500 metres, we see the P-63 beginning to start nose up, and we know they are coming directly towards us and trying to use their very powerful climb rate in the moderate altitude ranges all the way up to 5,000 metres altitude, and their ability for straight line acceleration and acceleration in a dive to try and get the jump on us. And here we can see how our plane is becoming unstable, and as we go to higher altitudes we do not have the flexibility of being able to climb away. Fortunately, however, we have timed this to the point where the P-63 A-10 was just on the limit, being able to force them to stall out and miss with their 37mm cannon fire as we came down on top of them. But this straight away exposes one of the chinks in the armour of this aircraft thanks to the addition of the 20mm cannon pods. Without the pods we would have had a similar situation, but we would have had more confidence in being more manoeuvrable and being able to cut over the top of the P-63 A-10 without the fear of the 37 striking us. And now as we carry our momentum through, we knock out a P-63 C5 and an ME-410 at longer ranges, and now we see the ultimate range conferred with the 20mm cannons as we rip apart a Heinkel 162 starting at 550 metres. And with a jet fighter like that, which is a rather small profile target, it is very difficult to hit that target with a 30mm cannon until you get in a range of approximately 350 metres, if not less. And this is one of the key advantages that the 20mm cannon pods confer, as we saw with that triple strike there. That you do not have to get as close in order to strike multiple targets, and in turn this provides you a better opportunity to boom and zoom through the masses when they are lined up in front of you. At the same time, however, this does mean that your energy retention as you break away is compromised a little bit further, and we have already repeated ourselves a number of times on that account. Meaning that we should move on to another positive. And in terms of the gun convergence, sticking it at 500 metres, this means that our 20mm cannon pods will converge in that range that we enjoy them in, 400 to 600 metres, where their additional range buffets the plane really nicely. And with the 13mm machine guns having a similar muzzle velocity, if not a slightly lower one to the 20mm cannons, this means that we can essentially bring the machine guns and the 20mm cannons into effect together, providing us with an alternative nature to the K-4, which we would really like to have carried over from say the Messerschmitt 109 G10 when we could field the 20mm cannon in the nose. So you get the best of both worlds, with the ability to have the 30mm Mk108 cannon in the nose and the addition of the 20mm cannons in the wings, and at the same time this means you have the armament capacity to deal with any foe at any given range. And it would be my recommendation for those of you who are new to flying planes such as the Messerschmitt 109 G series and K series to potentially have the 30mm cannon on a separate button by comparison with everything else if you are going to fly with the 20mm cannon pods. For myself, I will stick to the plane without the 20mm cannon pods because I prefer the raw performance of this plane and want to try and avoid the scare factors as we saw that P-63 A-10 King Cobra when they climb sharply after you and you may be on the limit or the verge of being shot down as they stall out underneath you and you need every inch of performance from the aircraft. So it is a key trade-off and one that can cut both ways. And hopefully we have depicted that here. In the meantime then we are going to continue to climb. And in terms of placing this plane in terms of an altitude position in the skies, this plane works very well within the altitude range of 4,000 to 6,500 metres altitude. We have said as you head towards 6,000 metres altitude, the overall performance of the plane begins to depreciate slightly in terms of the climb rate in particular, and perhaps even in terms of the straight line and climb rate acceleration nature. But at the same time we have to consider that this plane does have the ability to rebuild its speed rather rapidly and go into those rather elongated climbs, enabling it to stay up high and swoop down on its foes from above. and this means that this plane is very well suited to handle its predecessors, i.e. the G6, the G10 and the G14, and at the same time deal with a lot of planes that will be able to push for higher altitudes, such as the F-8F Bearcat, the Griffon Spitfires, the Focke 190D series, and the J2M4, 5 and 3, simply because it has the climb rate to get up to higher altitudes first, and then it has the ability to continue to perform with its DCM Daimler-Benz 605 engine up at these higher altitudes, even when its performance begins to fade away with altitude going up to the extreme levels of say 7, 8,000, 9,000 metres altitude. And by 10,000 metres altitude you will be suffering the same experience that you get with the majority of planes unless you are flying the likes of the TA152H1, and that is the plane becomes very difficult to handle and its overall engine and handling nature is compromised to a key point. One other thing to note about mounting the 20mm cannon pods in this plane is the effect that this has on the overall nature and responsiveness of the elevator control, as we will see here with the Arado 234B. We get a clean pass on them, and as we start to break up, the elevator becomes heavier to respond, and when you hit approximately 750 km an hour, this is echoed to an immense proportion. The elevator becomes a little bit heavy at the speed anyway without the cannon pods, but it becomes significantly stiffer with the pods attached. And this is something to be wary of when you have two opponents in close range of one another that you're trying to boom and zoom together, but one of them is above the other and you may be trying to swoop up. In these circumstances you may need to apply combat flaps and cut the engine in order to try and create that additional time on target, as otherwise you may overshoot and pass right in front of your opponent's guns, as I have made the mistake on 1 or 2 occasions. Here our friendly attacker decides to set up this Messerschmitt 19G for us. Very nice of them, and I would like to give a shout out to Power Rider for doing so. And here we can see how with the Messerschmitt 19G starting to break downwards, our 30mm cannon was not going to strike the target, as it is very difficult to compensate for a target who is trying to move out of the way once they know we are coming, simply because of the low muzzle velocity of the 30mm cannon. But with the 20s we have the additional range once again, and we have the flexibility to strike those who are aware of our presence. Something which we have seen time and time again in this match in my opinion, which we did not see in the first game. In the first match we attacked our targets when they were unaware of us, and as soon as they were aware it was a lot harder for us to get a shot onto target unless we forced them into a very poor state, either in a sharp turn or alternatively in a very low energy position. And knocking out the A26C here we pick up our 9th kill of the game, and once again break up and we can see we are echoing the same role as before, sustaining the position in the higher altitude regions of the sky and performing very linear boom and zoom passes. And again, with the pods attached, the linearity of our passes becomes much more significant. Without the pods, we could act in a more manoeuvrable fashion and change up our directionality of our boom and zoom pass from time to time. And if you're wondering why I'm keeping an eye on the attacker here, it's because at the time I wasn't actually sure what the aircraft was, and I spent a good portion of time after this game reading up on it. But we digress. Looking down we can only see 1 or 2 enemy planes left in the skies. This means that we have secured our position and achieved our role for the majority of this game, if not all of it, which is higher altitude dominance, and we notice a B-25 spawning in, which we want to grab as we want to pick up our 10th kill and therefore our double ace. Unfortunately everyone on the team is going to go for it, so we can hopefully just penetrate through. Noticing that our acceleration in the dive is compromised thanks to the addition of the pods, it is going to be a tough call. But we're going to go for it, with the zone now being captured by our team. Unfortunately we were too high to help capture it. It just goes to show how powerful the climb rate of the K-4 is once again. As we swoop down with the B-25 on fire, we knock them out for our 10th and final kill of the game. Some may say it's a kill still, but in my personal opinion, if a gunship like that is still flying, and we all know B-25Js are dangerous, it has to be dispatched no matter what the cost. And as we climb up once again and head into the clouds, we notice a Focke 190 down at extremely low altitudes being pursued by all of our friendly fighters. It is a target well outside of our reach, even with the 20mm cannon pods in our possession, and it is time for us just to meander about the skies, keep an eye on the sunset, and make sure that nobody else comes to interfere with us. And in doing so really this encapsulates the K-4 in a single statement, that it is the plane that will be patrolling the higher altitude regions of the sky throughout any given game, and it can very quickly sometimes lead to some rather tedious games if you're able to force your opponents down to lower altitudes earlier on, thanks to your very powerful climb rate with or without the pods. But if anything this goes in hand with the plane's nature, a very high performance Messerschmitt 19 as we come into our post game stats. With our 10 kills, we're able to pick up 52,590 silver lions and 4,729 research points. To defeat the BF-109 K-4 then, you can take one of two approaches. The first is to try and lure it into a turn-based fight, forcing it to medium to low speeds, i.e. those below 300 km an hour, where its manoeuvrability and turn circle begin to depreciate rather rapidly. It is in these instances that Griffin Spitfires, J2Ms and Yakovlev Yak-9 UTs will have their heyday with the K-4. The alternative is to try and ambush the K-4 when it is coming out of a boom and zoom pass and entering its reclimb. In a fast, medium to high altitude fighter, such as an LA-9, an F-8F-1B, or a Focke 190 D-12, you'll be able to latch onto the tail of the K-4 if you begin your attack at 450 km an hour, and eventually force the K-4 pilot to have to break into a split S or a sharp turn in order to try and come around on top of you. However, in this turn or manoeuvre, you'll be able to get guns on the K-4 and shoot them down. If left unattended, a K-4 will be able to wreak havoc in the skies, as depicted once again here, where we have come third by comparison to the rest of our team, with the addition of the extended range firepower of the 20mm cannon pods. Whilst this may be one of the hardest tier 4 grinds in the game, ladies and gentlemen, I strongly recommend to you to stay with it, as once you have the engine injection and the rest of the upgrades under your belt, you'll be able to reap the rewards very quickly. This is one of the most powerful energy fighters in the game, if not the most powerful, being able to attain higher altitudes well before anyone else, even some of the early jet fighters, and in doing so you'll be able to pick the time of death of your opponents at your choosing, simply because you'll be the claimer of souls. You will be the Grim Reaper. And so I've been a slightly ill TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, as always, take care and good luck in the skies!